author of Society Without Coercion and Public Services on the Laissez-Faire. He is a director of the Society for Individual Liberty and heads up the Services Office. I turn the floor over to Mr. Wollstein.
This will be a short speech. I'd like to start by reading the statement of libertarian anarchist Fred Woodward concerning an incident that took place less than 2 months ago at the University of Arizona in Tucson. The incident occurred during a student riot at the university, in which neither Mr. Woodward nor his wife Cheryl took part. This is a statement. On Thursday, January 21st, at 6 o'clock, as I waited in the student union for my wife to meet me for supper, several friends rushed in and told me Cheryl had been brutally beaten, dragged, and arrested by the police in what was later to prove a riot area in the vicinity of the university main gate. After driving hurriedly to the Pima County Jail, I was met by officers who, in their implacable malice and dishonesty, initiated what has been for my wife and me a continuing nightmare of horror and atrocity. Jail officials not only denied me permission to see her or talk with her on the telephone, but also refused to divulge any information about Cheryl's injuries or the charges against her, bragging only that when she refused to remove her wedding ring for them, they had fixed her. Later, I was to learn that this meant they had hurled my wife into a tiny, pitch-black icebox cell alone. Twice again, I returned with friends to the prison that evening, and was met each time with greater discourtesy and outright insult from the swaggering, overage juvenile delinquents. Many of them, most notably James E. Robinson and Jack Bowman, Dwayne Wilson and Richard Jackowitz, took immense delight in meeting our anxious inquiries with high-handed and haughty disrespect. At one point, the campus policeman, James Robinson, asserted, quote, "I didn't beat up your wife, but I goddamn wish I had." Robinson and Richard Jackowitz seemed to be the biggest cowards there, however, since at one point they actually threatened us for doing nothing more than staring at them. Suddenly, one cop must have snapped under the strain, for he uttered a loud, incoherent cry and rushed at us, knocking down Dean Ahmad to the floor. Then, as we watched, horrified, Dean was dragged by his canteen strap, which went around his throat, to the front door, and the rest of us were ourselves shoved out onto the porch and told to leave. Feeling we were in great danger, we decided to leave at once, and we walked hurriedly to our cars. But then the officers who had told us to leave rushed out, firing a shot at us, and ordered us to halt. As I stopped my car and got out, I saw Bowman and Robinson, who had said he'd wished he'd beaten up my wife, running toward us. Bowman approached me and said, "Robinson, this man is yours. Hey, everybody, Robinson gets to take this one." Then in the gloom of that parking lot, as Bowman went to beat up Dean, Robinson struck me in the groin and began viciously twisting my arm and shoving me violently. Officer Gallagher of the Sheriff's Department watched impassively. Then I and Dean Ernest Olson were roughly jerked and shoved across the lot and literally thrown into prison. There, we who had been assaulted by these criminals were ourselves charged with assault and were imprisoned until the next day. We were not permitted to see an attorney, and we were not properly fed. We were held in inhuman conditions of filth. Is this incident a rare example of normally peaceful, rational, and just policemen overreacting in a tense atmosphere? Or is it a common, though largely unknown occurrence in America today? A sign of an underlying corruption in the present American system of justice? This is clearly a crucial question for both libertarians and non-libertarians alike, for no valid analysis of our society can proceed from an incorrect conception of it. Shamefully, disgracefully, and incredibly, virtually all the evidence indicates that such blatant violations of the rights of the individual by police and magistrates Contrary to popular mythology of conservatives and liberals alike, the present American system of criminal procedures is not one of justice, but injustice. What is the evidence? Consider the following. According to the FBI Uniform Crime Report for 1967, 39.7 thousand persons were arrested for having the audacity to consider their bodies their own property and rent them in prostitution to necessarily willing customers. 84.7 thousand were arrested in that year for daring to gamble without government permission. 94.9 thousand were picked up by the cops for being out on the street later than the state decreed was proper, or for loitering. 101,000 were booked for believing that they had the right to consume or sell drugs in willing exchange. 129,000 of the disenfranchised were told that they did not own their own bodies, but belonged to their parents and therefore didn't have a right to leave home. And well over 500,000 citizens were arrested for the heinous crime of not having a fixed residence or a job that the government approved of. In all, during 1967, as many as 75% of all arrests in this free republic, representing 4 million people, or 2% of the entire population of the United States, were arrested for what we as libertarians must necessarily call moral non-crimes, crimes without victims, acts which the government violently disapproves of, but which do not violate anyone's rights. Although many thousands of these persons were released for lack of evidence or other reasons, thousands more were tried, convicted, and sentenced to years of imprisonment for the crime of trying to live their own life as they saw fit. Thus, since the police and courts and prisons spend up to 3/4 of their time violating rather than protecting individual rights, the only rational conclusion that one can come to is they are not our protectors primarily, but our violent enemies. If we must concede that they may spend 1/4 of their time pursuing true criminals, we must also comment that such actions probably result from their confusion as to what their true nature and purpose is, as indicated by what they do with the other 3/4 of their time. In fact, the agents of the American injustice system must be considered to be suffering from the same ethical confusion which afflicts the majority of Americans, a confusion about what are and are not proper objects of social control. The police simply personify the irrationality more clearly, this time protecting an individual's rights, that time blatantly violating them. But a man who is moral, even virtuous, some of the time, and an aggressor the rest of the time, cannot be termed a hero, but a villain. Even if the police spent only 1/325th of their time, the equivalent of 1 day out of every year, violating individual rights, they would still necessarily be classed as moral criminals, even as you and I would necessarily be if we scrupulously respected the rights of our fellow men every day except Groundhog Day, when we went on a rampage of trespass, assault, and murder. Nor can it be argued that the police, courts, and prisons are merely doing their legal duty, and that the evil liberal politicians, or the evil conservative politicians, depending upon your bias, are really responsible for the evil laws. In the first place, all men are morally responsible for their actions. Unless you have a gun pointed at your head, it is the most monstrous evil to tear a person from his home and loved ones and throw him in a cell for a victimless crime. And the police, courts, judges, and jailers clearly use force to deprive the individual of his freedom and, in some cases, his life. There can be no such thing as a duty to violate the rights of others. There can be no excuse for voluntarily joining an organization dedicated to violating the rights of the individual 3/4 of the time. There can be no amelioration of guilt to refer to orders from above when one did not have to join a criminal gang to begin with. If a given policeman quits, then someone else would simply take his place, you might say. So it really makes no difference. But it does. In the first place, it makes a difference to the person who quits, He is no longer a criminal. He is no longer violating people's rights nor enforcing immoral laws. In the second place, it does make a finite, if small, difference to the state, which must now go to the trouble and expense of locating a new thug. And meanwhile, the thug labor market is decreased by one, and there's at least temporarily one less thug to violate our rights. To put it more plainly, no one is yet forced to join the police, courts, or prison system. All violation of individual rights which the American justice system commits are engaged in by volunteers, without whom the system would collapse. Furthermore, the police, courts, and prisons do initiate force. While legislators may have passed laws, the police are the ones holding the real guns. And without their enforcement of laws, no individual rights would be violated. After all, who cares if the state outlaws making love upside down if no one is busted for it? Thus, the police, judges, and jailers bear the final responsibility for the violation of the rights of the individual. It then follows, since they are the ones actually initiating force in America, it is they, most of all, who are properly subject to direct physical retaliation. Thus, even while conservatives and unenlightened objectivists rant and rave about the potential dangers of new leftists if they got in power, the new fascists, already in power, proceed to strip away every vestige of individual liberty in America. No such violations of the rights of the individual are not new. The lineup, legislative morality, and blind obedience to the law are as old as government. But the belief by whole populations that since we live in a democracy, the law should be obeyed, is relatively new. The American people, including unfortunately most objectivists, have been seduced by a deadly myth. The myth that since we get to vote for our government, it is therefore proper. It took the advent of modern democracy to reduce political awareness to such a low level. As Roy Childs has pointed out, in previous centuries, the state was equally or more despotic, but at least men recognized it for what it was, a criminal gang. They obeyed it out of fear, but they did not surrender their souls to it out of love. In the modern American state, we see the coming of Big Brother, the big criminal, whom men embrace not out of fear, but out of ignorant love. If freedom and free men are to survive this century, it is most of all this myth, the myth of democracy, which must be dispelled. And the American injustice system is a good place to start. Okay. Okay, I'll now take questions, if there are any. Yes?